A while ago, I read about a cigarette company that ran an extensive advertising campaign in the 1960s and 70s to promote its product. Some of you who are old enough may remember it. I checked it out, not the cigarette, but the ad in the internet. It showed a person with a black eye smoking the company's cigarette. Sometimes the person was a young man, sometimes a young woman, sometimes it was a middle-aged person. But regardless of who it was, the punchline was always the same. I would rather fight than switch.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Life of self-sacrificing love like his own. It is for this reason that his apostle, St. Paul, clearly states that marriage is now and for all time to be considered a great mystery, intimately bound up with the supernatural union of Christ and the Church, which union is also to be its pattern. This union then is most serious because it will bind you together for life in a relationship so close and so intimate that it will profoundly influence your whole future. That future with its hopes and disappointments, its successes and its failures, its pleasures and its pains, its joys and its sorrows, is hidden from your eyes. You know that these elements are mingled in every life and are to be expected in your own. And so, not knowing what is before you, you take each other for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health until death. Truly then, these words are most serious. It is a beautiful tribute to your undoubted faith in each other, that recognizing their full import, you are nevertheless so willing and ready to pronounce them. And because these words involve such solemn obligations, it is most fitting that you rest the security of your wedded life upon the great principle of self-sacrifice. And so you begin your married life by the voluntary and complete surrender of your individual lives in the interest of that deeper and wider life for which you are to have in common. Henceforth, you belong entirely to each other. You will be one in mind, one in heart, and one in affections. And whatever sacrifices you may hereafter be required to make to preserve this common life, always make them generously. Sacrifice is usually difficult and irksome. Only love can make it easy, and perfect love can make it a joy. We are willing to give in proportion as we love, and when love is perfect, the sacrifice is complete. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and the Son so loved us that he gave himself for our salvation. Greater love than this no one has, that one laid down his life for his friends. No greater blessing can come to your married life than pure conjugal love, loyal and true to the end. May then this love, with which you join your hands and hearts today, never fail, but grow deeper and stronger as the years go on. And if true love and the unselfish spirit of perfect sacrifice guide your every action, you can expect the greatest measure of earthly happiness that may be allotted to man in this vale of tears. The rest is in the hands of God. Nor will God be wanting to your needs. He will pledge you the lifelong support of his graces and the holy sacrament which you are now going to receive. Please rise. Michael Francis, do you take Lauren Marie here present for your lawful wife according to the rite of our Holy Mother the Church?
I do.
Lauren Marie, do you take Michael Francis here present for your lawful husband according to the rite of our Holy Mother the Church?
I do.
Now join your right hands and say after me.
I, Michael Francis, take you, Lauren Marie, for my lawful wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for rich or for poor, in sickness and in health, until death do us part.
I, Lauren Marie, take you, Michael Francis, for my lawful husband, to have and to hold, from this day forth, for better, for worse, for rich, for poor, and for poor, in sickness and in health, until death do us part.
Ego conjungo vos in matrimonium in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I call upon all of you here present to be witnesses of this holy union which I have now blessed. Man must not separate what God has joined together.
As you can see from the service, music was so important to my grandmother. And it's been just beautiful. So thank you. Governor and First Lady Kemp, thank you. Senators Warnock and Ossoff, thank you. Congress people, Mayor Dickens, thank you all. And again, a special thank you. Secretary Clinton, Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Obama, Mrs. Trump, and Dr. Biden. Thank you all for coming and acknowledging this remarkable sisterhood that you share with my grandmother. And thank you all for your leadership that you provided for our country and the world. Secretary Clinton and Dr. Biden, we also welcome your lovely husbands. I mean, this is a difficult day for my family, but we have been so enormously gratified by the love and support that we have felt from across the world. So thank you so much. And as Reverend Warnock told me, my grandmother doesn't need a eulogy. Her life was a sermon. And it was a mighty testament to the power of faith and to the power of a deep and determined love. And she lived this public love story that we all know of, that has inspired the world, including in these last days. And I think of all the things she accomplished, her most viral moment was when they were at a baseball game and the Braves put them on the kiss cam. And just like today, I mean, people were crying at the Braves game, you know. But we heard about it for years. It's amazing. But in my family, we all experienced those more private love stories. And she was my grandmother first. And she was like everyone else's grandmother in a lot of ways. Almost all of her recipes call for mayonnaise, for example. We all got cards from her on our birthdays. $20 bill in it. When I was 45, $20 bill. Like, and she was so down to earth, y'all. It was amazing. And one of the stories we've been talking about in my family these last few days is we were on a family trip and we were on a flight on Delta from here to somewhere. And we were all sitting in the back of the airplane together and it took off. And we looked over, my grandmother took out this Tupperware of pimento cheese. And this loaf of bread, and she just started making sandwiches. And she gave it to all of us grandkids and everyone else, and then she just started giving them to other people on the plane. And people were sitting there like, Rosalind Carter just made me this sandwich, you know? And they couldn't believe it, but she loved people. And she was a cool grandma. She was cool, like, she did Tai Chi with this sword. And if you want to see a 5-year-old boy be excited, they would come back, Dad, you know Mom Carter has a sword, you know? She once told me about this trip, Papa, that y'all took to Havana in the 50s. She said y'all went down there for the night and you didn't get a hotel room. And I said, what'd you do? And she looked at me like, we danced. We slept on the plane.
In many ways, I love $29 donors more than I love those big, fat, beautiful $1 million.
They danced, didn't they? She was a rock for our family, and that's true, but in many ways, she was more, as Chip said, an adventurer, a voyager, a mountain climber. She learned to ski in her 60s and then skied for 25 more years. As Chip said, she fished trout streams from Georgia to Wyoming and from Venezuela to Siberia, visited 120 countries, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Fuji and summited peaks in Bolivia and other places. And I know that she went to the Everest base camp in Nepal. And I can guarantee you that she was looking up at that thing and thinking, if they would just let me. And based on what she did, I think she could have done it. She was born just a few years after women got the right to vote in this small town in the South where people were still plowing their fields behind mules. But she was made for these long journeys, and she was made to summit these mountains. As they said before, when she started in politics, she'd never talked to a group of people bigger than her Sunday school class. And then she elected a governor and a president. She shaped our national policies. She faced down dictators herself on issues of human rights. She built the Carter Center from an idea into a powerhouse for human rights. And as the chair of that board, I've watched her do it, and it's because she poured out her love. All over the world, and especially, as Kathy said, the end of the road. Her 122 countries included Liberia and Mali and Sudan. And it was natural for her to open up her heart to those people, not with pity, but as partners. And she knew in those communities and recognized that ancient steel from rural women who carried their children and their communities on their backs. Whether they're from a 600-person town in South Georgia or South Sudan. As the song says, she knew what comes back when you give your love away. And for my grandmother, what came back was this unshakable strength and this powerful faith, and not just an abiding love, but a fierce, determined, adventurous love that sustained her on all of these long journeys. Journeys, like Kathy mentioned, of her guinea worm eradication, which has taken almost 40 years. But the Carter Center's unwavering efforts and their powerful partners in these tiny villages took a disease that affected 3.5 million people every year in the poorest parts of the world. And this year there won't be millions of cases, Papa. This year we've had 7 total cases. And we're in the last mile because she could see far and she kept going. Was not afraid of these long journeys. Her advocacy for mental health was a 50-year climb that is as remarkable as any other, and has been mentioned already. But if you imagine just how far our society has come in the last 5 years on issues of mental health, and you think that she decided in 1970 to tackle the ancient stigma associated with mental illness, it is remarkable how far she could see and how far she was willing to walk. And that effort changed lives, and it saved lives, including in my own family. She was made for these long journeys. The Rosalind Carter Institute helps caregivers because you can't journey alone. Even the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail goes 3,000 gardens from Mexico to Canada, help monarch butterflies on their journeys. John Lewis once said that in all of his marches, he only really learned one thing. Don't let them turn you around. That was my grandmother to a T. One of my last memories of her was in a hospital. We were there for my grandfather, but she had her own physical limitations that made it hard for her to walk. She had to practice. She was ready to go for one of these walks, and she picked up this cane. And I looked at the cane. She looked at me and she said, "You know, it's not a cane." And she said, "It's a trekking pole." She said, "It's the exact same kind that those women use when they go to the South Pole." I watched her walk down that hall, that trekking pole, and I followed her. And I just pray that we never lose sight of that path. Amen, and thank you.
Peace be with you. Friends, we come to this great feast of Corpus Christi. So every year, right at the end of the whole Easter season, just before we turn back to ordinary time, we celebrate the Feast of Corpus Christi. And of course, this year, as the church in the U.S. is going through a lengthy Eucharistic revival, it's good for us once again to turn to this greatest of sacraments. You know, we've looked at the Eucharist from all kinds of different angles. What I want to do today is to talk about something which has become very dear to me in the course of my life, and that is Eucharistic adoration. To be honest with you, when I was a young man, even my seminary years, we were kind of discouraged from doing Eucharistic adoration because we thought, it detracted from the Mass. It was a static presence, not an active presence, all that. And I just come to realize that's so much nonsense, all of that. One of the great prophets, I think, of adoration and of the holy hour was the great Fulton Sheen. And just as I record these words, just a few weeks ago, I was up at St. Paul Seminary, where a lot of my seminarians from Winona, Rochester go. And I gave a day of reflection to the faculty and students. And when I was there in the chapel, I started talking about Eucharistic adoration. And one of the teachers reminded me afterwards, Sheen attended this seminary and would have prayed in this chapel. In fact, learned the discipline of the holy hour when he was there. And that really moved me. And I said to the students, and I think it was after lunch, I said, this should be just a real focus of your spiritual attention, that Fulton Sheen himself learned this great art and task when he was a student there. So, what's it all about? I go back to my spiritual hero, Thomas Aquinas, who beautifully, and this image has stayed in my mind ever since I read it. He said, at the words of consecration, it's as though a fire is kindled in a new place. So it's the same Christ, same fire, if you want, all over the world, but he can be kindled in a new place. I thought of this when I moved into my house in Rochester. I'd just been appointed bishop, and I moved into my house, and the moving boxes were still all around, But as soon as I could, I went to the chapel. We had designated a room as the chapel, had an altar set up there. As soon as I could, I got out the books for Mass and everything, and I said the Mass and consecrated the Eucharist and consecrated a host to put in the pyx in the tabernacle. I had a vivid sense of kindling a fire. And it's before that fire, this morning I was there doing my holy hour. Adoration, everybody, is staying close to the fire. Think of fire, that gives light against the darkness. It gives heat against the cold. It provides protection against enemies. But we live in kind of a cold world. This coldly secularistic world that we're in. I know a lot of young people celebrate it. God knoweth why. But the secular world, for the soul, is a cold and dreary place because the soul is wired for God. The soul is ordered to God. What's the Eucharist as we come to the tabernacle to adore? But it's warmth against that cold. It's light against the darkness. We live in a fallen world. We know that. And the fallen world is a dark place. Darkness is a great biblical symbol for losing the way, not knowing where I'm going, stumbling about. That's the way a lot of us live. Even, stars and celebrities and all this. But they're lost spiritually, these people. They're stumbling about. What's the Eucharist? But it's light against the darkness. The fallen world is also a place that's filled with enemies. We know that. You could go on a camping trip in the beautiful woods and all that, and you take in the loveliness of the day. But, at night, you got to be aware of the fact that those woods are also full of predators, of dangers. And fire from primordial times was a way of keeping those at bay. Do we live in a world with lots of visible enemies? You bet. Look around. The way the church is often beleaguered today, the way the faith is under attack. I mean, just go on any time of the day or night on the internet and see the faith being attacked. Do we also have invisible enemies? You bet. We struggle not just against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities. Okay, what keeps the predators at bay but the fire? What's Eucharistic adoration? It seems to me, everybody, it's a conscious act of staying close to the fire. Spiritual warmth, spiritual light, spiritual protection comes from there. An image from Fulton Sheen again, because he wrote a lot about the holy hour, which was so central to his spirituality. He said, I feel like I'm a dog at the feet of his master. And the master might not need me right now. The master is doing his own thing, or he's whatever. But I'm here. And if he needs me, I'm ready to move. And I might just be like, think of a dog just lying at his master's feet, not doing very much, but it's ready. He's there. So someone who is sitting or kneeling in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, maybe not doing a lot, not actively engaged in the life of the church, but ready at his master's feet, ready to respond when he's needed. I like that. Don't you love too? It's been attributed to a lot of different people. What happens in Eucharistic adoration? I look at him, he looks at me. It's the way two friends can be with each other in silence. I mean, not really doing anything. What did you guys do? Well, we didn't really accomplish very much, but we were with each other. We were in each other's presence. Something of that, I think, in Eucharistic adoration, spending time with the Lord. So many of the saints were devoted to the Eucharist in just this way. And I find a lot of edification from this. Don't believe people, by the way, who say, and you'll still hear it today, that there's something primitive about Eucharistic adoration, something immature. Forget that. Some of the greatest figures in our tradition were devoted to it. Aquinas again. His secretary, Reginald Properno, he was with him for many years, knew him very well. He said Aquinas solved far more intellectual problems through prayer than he did through thought. He's one of the great thinkers in the Western tradition. But his secretary thought he solved most of his problems, not by thinking it through so much as praying. He testified that Thomas would often go into the chapel and he would even rest his head against the tabernacle, as though seeking direct inspiration. That's Aquinas. Another hero of mine, St. John Henry Newman, was very devoted to the Eucharistic presence. Writes a series of prayers, you can still get them, born of his devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. They're marvelous, still worth praying. One of my favorite stories here regards Ida Stein, the great 20th century martyr. Ida Stein was from a Jewish family, brought up in the Jewish faith, but by the time she was in her late teens or early 20s, she'd become an atheist, rejected her religious tradition completely. But then through a lengthy and fascinating process, she kind of reads herself back into the faith and then into Catholicism. And before she was a consecrated religious, so she was a lay woman now on fire with the Lord and trying to find her path, she would spend hour upon hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament in Eucharistic adoration. She was staying for a time when she was still a layperson in a convent, and the nuns there were so impressed by her devotion that they created a little chair for her, and it was behind a pillar so people in the church, wouldn't be kind of gawking at her. It's like her own special place where she would give herself over to Eucharistic adoration. What gave her, by the way, the strength of character and soul to become the great martyr she was? I'm convinced those hours and hours spent before the Blessed Sacrament. Ida Stein. Jacques Maritain, one of the greatest Catholic intellectuals of the last century. Read his life story, fascinating. Read his books, marvelous. Catholic philosopher, cultural commentator, political commentator, etc. Maritain, when he was in Paris, so he traveled the world, but he was based in Paris, he'd come home, and his custom was, at the end of the day, he'd make his way through Paris to Montmartre, which is the area of the city where the Church of Sacré-Cœur is found, of the Sacred Heart. And Maritain would go into that church. He'd kneel before the Blessed Sacrament, and he'd spend the whole night in vigil, the whole night in adoration. By the way, at Sacré-Cœur, the Eucharist has been adored nonstop, 24 hours a day since the late 19th century. And Maritain was one of the people who continued that great chain of devotion. Mother Teresa of Calcutta. When I was there in Calcutta at her mother house, we were filming there years ago. You go into this very simple space with the Blessed Sacrament. And at first, it looks like one of the nuns praying, because they created this little statue in the posture and attitude of Mother Teresa. She's kind of crouched down and kind of hunched over. I think she has a rosary in her hand. But it's exactly where she sat in prayer, in adoration for hour upon hour. What informed her work with the poor, what made it possible, was Eucharistic adoration. That's where her strength came from. I love the story about Dorothy Day, another hero of mine, the foundress of the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy Day had a deep devotion to the Eucharist, the Blessed Sacrament. A priest came to the Catholic worker house in New York to say Mass. And it was the late 60s, and it was kind of time of experimentation, and he thought he was being very hip. And so he took a coffee mug from the shelf and used that for the chalice. Well, he celebrated Mass, and Dorothy Day very reverently, followed the Mass and received the Eucharist, thanked the priest, sent him on his way. And then she purified that coffee mug, but then she put it in a towel and took a hammer and broke it up into pieces, and then went out in the backyard, and then she buried it deep in the ground. And her friends are like, what are you doing? And she said, how could I ever use this as a coffee mug that held the blood of Christ? And that's where her power in caring for the poor came from. I'll give you one more story about the great Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. And I got this from a witness. Sister Theodosia was one of the wonderful Polish sisters who helped Cardinal George. In the years I lived there, I came to know these nuns well. And Theodosia was in her mother house in Krakow. And Karol Wojtyła, when he was archbishop, loved to come there to pray. So she saw him come into the chapel, and then she was doing her work and so on. And then she never saw him come out. And so she went in and she looked around, didn't see him, came out, asked around, came back, looked around, didn't see him. And I thought, what happened to him? Well, finally, the third time she goes back in the chapel, she sees Karol Wojtyła spread eagle on the ground, adoring the Blessed Sacrament. Don't tell me somehow Eucharistic adoration is a primitive form of spiritual practice. Forget it. Forget that. Some of the greatest saints, listen, have stayed close to that fire, holding off the cold, holding off the darkness, holding off the dangers. On this Feast of Corpus Christi, can I warmly recommend to everybody Eucharistic adoration? And God bless you.
from the graveyard of forgotten favorites. And thank the Lord, Rush Limbaugh's on.